The rain pounded the valley like an endless gray veil, and the roar of the raging waters echoed through the hills. Jackson Hayes, on his usual route back to his cabin, almost missed the faint whinny carried by the wind. It was only when he stopped and held his breath, ignoring the biting cold, that the desperate sound became clear. Something, or someone, was in danger. Peering through the dense curtain of rain, he finally saw it, a drenched and trembling young colt fighting to stay above the torrent. It was far too small to be out there alone. Surely it had been separated from its herd. The animal's large, dark eyes, filled with terror, locked onto his for an eternal second. Jackson muttered under his breath, "Hang on, boy. I'm coming to get you." He didn't hesitate. Jackson stepped into the icy water with determined strides, but each move was a struggle against the river's relentless force. The current lashed at him violently while the young colt, who he would later name Sundance, thrashed weakly, barely holding on. When Jackson finally got close enough, he stretched out his arms and grabbed the animal. The small body was rigid with fear and cold, almost lifeless. The journey back to the bank felt impossible. Sundance was heavier than he'd expected, and Jackson's legs weakened with every step against the fierce current. A powerful surge of water nearly knocked him off balance, but he held firm. "Not now. You're not going under," he muttered through clenched teeth. Inch by inch, he pushed forward, defying the river's wrath, until he finally reached a safer, shallower spot. Collapsing to his knees on the bank, Jackson pulled Sundance close to his chest. The colt was trembling violently, but still alive. Both of them gasped for air, their desperate breaths mixing with the unrelenting sound of the rain. Jackson looked into the colt's terrified eyes and felt a wave of relief and resolve. "You're strong, Sundance. Stronger than you know." But he knew this was just the beginning. The storm was far from over, and the colt needed immediate care. Jackson couldn't let fate take this young, helpless creature. Without wasting another moment, he stood up, holding Sundance tightly, and began the long walk toward the safety of his cabin. The storm showed no signs of relenting. The trail back to Jackson's cabin was treacherous, with the mud turning the path into a slippery maze. Each step threatened to send him and Sundance tumbling into the earth. Jackson adjusted his grip on the colt, feeling the animal's heart racing against his chest. The poor thing was exhausted and barely able to keep its head up. Jackson whispered, "Hold on, Sundance. We're almost there." As he pushed forward, his thoughts drifted to the past. It had been years since he'd last cared for a horse. His family used to run a small ranch before everything fell apart. Losing the ranch, and worse, losing the people he loved, had driven him deep into isolation. He had sworn never to open his heart again, to avoid the pain of attachment. Yet here he was, risking everything to save this vulnerable creature. Perhaps it wasn't just Sundance who needed saving. The cabin finally came into view through the downpour. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure tucked into the trees, but it was home. Jackson kicked the door open with his boot and stumbled inside, dripping water onto the floorboards. He gently lowered Sundance onto an old blanket near the fireplace, which remained cold and unlit. His hands trembled from exhaustion as he worked to start a fire. The kindling caught after a few tries, and soon the room was filled with a warm, flickering light. Sundance lay motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Jackson knelt beside him, running his hand over the colt's soaked coat. "You made it," he said softly. The warmth of the fire slowly began to reach them both. Sundance blinked a few times, his large eyes reflecting the firelight. He gave a weak, tired snort, as if acknowledging Jackson's presence. It was a small sign of life, but it meant everything. Jackson stood and grabbed an old towel, drying the colt as best he could. He knew Sundance was far from out of danger. The cold could still claim him if his body didn't warm up soon. Jackson brought a bucket of water from the corner and poured a small amount into a bowl. "Here," he said, holding it close to Sundance's mouth. The colt hesitated before taking a few slow sips, his ears twitching slightly in response to the crackling fire. For the first time in hours, Jackson allowed himself to breathe more easily. The storm raged on outside, but within the cabin, there was a sense of fragile peace. Jackson sat down beside Sundance, his back against the wall. He could hear the howling wind battering the windows, but it no longer seemed to matter. Looking at the colt, he whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Sundance. Neither of us is." The storm continued through the night, pounding against the walls of the cabin like a relentless drumbeat. Jackson didn't sleep. He stayed by Sundance's side, watching every rise and fall of the colt's chest. His mind was a battlefield of memories, some long buried, now clawing their way to the surface. He couldn't shake the image of another horse, one he had once loved just as much. It had been 10 years since the accident. Back then, he was a different man, hopeful, full of dreams. His father's ranch was thriving, and Jackson had been inseparable from a stallion named Apache. The two of them were a team, working the ranch as if they shared one mind. But one stormy night had changed everything. A flash flood swept through the valley, and in the chaos, Apache had broken free and disappeared into the wilderness. Jackson had searched for days, but the stallion was never found. The grief never left him. Jackson shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. Sundance shifted slightly, letting out a faint whimper in his sleep. Jackson reached out, gently stroking the colt's neck. "You're safe now," he murmured. But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. Was he really capable of keeping this animal safe? He had failed once before. What if he failed again? As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the rain began to ease. Jackson stood and stretched his aching limbs. He needed to check the area outside to ensure the flooding hadn't reached the cabin. Before stepping out, he glanced back at Sundance, who now seemed to be resting more peacefully. The warmth of the fire had done its job. For now, at least, the colt was stable. Outside, the landscape was transformed. The river had swelled, carving new paths through the muddy earth. Fallen branches and debris littered the trail Jackson had taken the night before. He surveyed the scene with a grim expression. The storm had caused more damage than he had anticipated. If Sundance's herd had been anywhere nearby, they were likely scattered or worse. Returning to the cabin, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He had a decision to make. Sundance couldn't survive on his own, not in this condition. If the herd couldn't be found, Jackson would have to raise the colt himself. It was a daunting thought, one that stirred both fear and a strange sense of purpose. As he re-entered the cabin and saw Sundance slowly lifting his head, Jackson whispered, "Looks like you're stuck with me for a while." The morning brought an eerie calm to the valley. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the rain had finally stopped. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. Jackson crouched beside Sundance, who had finally managed to stand on his shaky legs. The colt's movements were slow and unsteady, but it was progress. Jackson smiled faintly. "That's it, Sundance. You've got some fight in you after all." Sundance sniffed the air cautiously and took a few hesitant steps across the wooden floor. His large, expressive eyes surveyed his surroundings with a mix of curiosity and fear. Jackson stayed nearby, moving slowly so as not to startle him. Over the years, he had learned that patience was everything when it came to animals. They needed time to trust, and Jackson wasn't in any hurry. He knew that trust couldn't be forced. After a few minutes of exploration, Sundance wandered over to Jackson and nuzzled his hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Jackson chuckled softly. "You've got a lot of spirit, kid," he said, running his fingers through the colt's still damp coat. In that moment, something shifted inside him. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this kind of connection, the silent understanding between man and horse. It was as if Sundance was filling a void Jackson had long tried to ignore. The colt's stomach let out a loud, rumbling growl, breaking the moment. Jackson stood and walked over to a small storage chest near the kitchen area. He rummaged through it, pulling out a bag of oats. "I don't have much, but this should do for now," he said, pouring a small amount into a bowl. Sundance eagerly approached, sniffing the contents before eating with surprising enthusiasm. Jackson smiled again. "You'll be back to full strength in no time if you keep that up." As Sundance ate, Jackson's thoughts drifted once more to the future. Raising a wild horse wasn't an easy task, especially one that had likely been separated from its herd at such a young age. He would need to find out if there were any nearby ranchers who might know more about the Mustang herds in the area. Yet a part of him didn't want to think about letting Sundance go. The bond between them was forming faster than he had expected. For now, there was no rush. Jackson pulled a chair closer to the fire and sat down, watching as Sundance finished his meal and lay back down near the warm hearth. The colt's eyes slowly closed, his breathing steady and calm. Jackson felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Maybe this storm had brought more than just destruction. Maybe it had brought a chance for both of them to heal. The following day, the sky finally cleared, revealing patches of pale blue through the remaining clouds. Jackson stepped outside with Sundance close behind him. The colt hesitated at the doorway, his ears flicking nervously at every unfamiliar sound. Jackson gave him a reassuring pat. "Come on, Sundance. Time to stretch those legs." Slowly, the colt followed, his hooves sinking into the soft, muddy ground. The valley around them bore the scars of the storm. Large branches lay scattered across the trail, and deep gouges marked where the river had overflown its banks. Jackson scanned the horizon, his gaze lingering on the distant hills. Somewhere out there, Sundance's herd might still be searching for him. Wild horses were resilient, but a storm of this magnitude could have scattered them far beyond the valley. The thought of Sundance being left behind twisted something in Jackson's chest. They walked along the trail that led toward the river. Sundance stayed close to Jackson's side, occasionally stopping to sniff the ground. Jackson observed the colt carefully. Despite his cautious steps, Sundance's strength was returning, and his eyes held more curiosity than fear. It was a good sign. As they reached a clearing near the riverbank, Jackson froze. Hoofprints, fresh and scattered, marked the muddy ground. He crouched to get a better look. "These aren't from you," Jackson murmured, running his fingers over the indentations. The tracks were deep, suggesting full-grown horses. Jackson stood and glanced around the area. They hadn't crossed paths with anyone on the way here, which meant these prints could only belong to wild horses. His heart quickened. Maybe Sundance's herd wasn't too far after all. Sundance seemed to sense something too. He raised his head, his ears perked and alert. A soft, distant whinny echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Sundance's head snapped in the direction of the sound. Jackson felt a surge of hope but tempered it with caution. "Could be them," he said quietly. "Let's find out." He guided the colt toward the source of the sound, carefully navigating through the muddy terrain. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whinny came again, this time clearer. Sundance let out a small cry in response. The colt's pace quickened, pulling Jackson along with him. Jackson's mind raced. If this really was Sundance's herd, what would happen next? Would they accept him back? He knew enough about wild horses to understand that reunions weren't always simple. Still, he couldn't deny the spark of hope igniting inside him. Jackson and Sundance moved carefully through the thick underbrush, the distant whinnies growing louder with each step. Sundance's energy surged as he tugged at the lead Jackson held loosely in his hand. The colt's movements were more confident now, as if he instinctively knew where he was going. Jackson quickened his pace to keep up. His heartbeat matched the anticipation rising in his chest. They reached a ridge overlooking a wide clearing. Jackson crouched, pulling Sundance gently beside him. Below, a group of wild mustangs grazed near a shallow stream. Their coats shimmered in the sunlight that finally broke through the clouds. There were at least a dozen of them, mares, foals, and a large, imposing stallion standing watch. Sundance tensed, his ears perked as he let out another high-pitched whinny. Several of the horses below raised their heads in response. The stallion stomped his hoof and released a powerful snort, his gaze locking onto Jackson and Sundance. The air seemed to still for a moment as the two groups sized each other up. Jackson knew better than to approach too quickly. Wild horses were fiercely protective of their own. Any sudden movement could be seen as a threat. He knelt beside Sundance and whispered, "Easy now. Let them come to you." Sundance, however, couldn't wait. He took a few cautious steps down the ridge, his movements deliberate and slow. The stallion watched him carefully, his nostrils flaring as he assessed the situation. One of the mares broke from the herd and approached Sundance, her steps measured but steady. Sundance froze, unsure of what to do next. Jackson held his breath, watching the silent exchange unfold. The mare sniffed at Sundance, circling him slowly. Sundance remained still, his eyes wide but curious. After a moment, the mare gave a soft nicker and gently nuzzled his neck. It was a sign of acceptance. Sundance responded with a quiet whimper of relief, stepping closer to her. The rest of the herd began to relax, their grazing resuming as the tension dissipated. Jackson felt a wave of relief wash over him. The herd had recognized Sundance as one of their own. Jackson stood at a distance, letting Sundance bond with the herd. Yet, a bittersweet feeling crept into his mind. He had brought Sundance this far, but now the colt might not need him anymore. It was what he had wanted, a safe return to his family, but Jackson couldn't ignore the pang of loss tightening in his chest. He sighed softly and whispered, "Looks like you found your way home, Sundance." Jackson stood silently on the ridge, watching Sundance integrate with the herd below. The colt moved among the other mustangs with a mixture of hesitance and growing confidence. The mare who had greeted him stayed close, nudging him forward whenever he lingered behind. Sundance let out a playful snort, slowly relaxing into his new surroundings. Jackson crossed his arms, feeling pride in the colt's progress but also a deep sense of unease. He knew the logical thing to do: leave Sundance with the herd. They could teach him the ways of survival in the wild in ways Jackson never could. But the thought of turning his back on the young colt tore at him. In the short time they had spent together, Jackson had formed a bond he hadn't expected. He hadn't felt this connected to anyone, or anything, in years. Letting Sundance go would mean returning to his solitary life, one he wasn't sure he could face anymore. Sundance's head suddenly turned toward Jackson, as if sensing his inner turmoil. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment the colt hesitated. He let out a soft cry, causing the mare beside him to glance up. Jackson felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he didn't need anyone. But Sundance had broken through those walls without even trying. The sound of hoofbeats drew Jackson's attention. The lead stallion was moving toward Sundance, his posture calm but authoritative. The colt lowered his head slightly in deference, a natural sign of submission to the leader of the herd. Jackson knew what that meant. The stallion was accepting Sundance as part of the group. It was exactly what Jackson had hoped for when he set out that morning, yet it brought with it an unexpected pain, one he hadn't prepared for. Jackson sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. He knelt down, his boots sinking into the wet earth, and watched as Sundance continued to interact with the other mustangs. He had a choice to make. He could leave now and trust that Sundance would be safe, or he could take the risk of trying to keep the colt with him, knowing that doing so might go against the natural order. It was a decision that carried weight on both sides. Sundance took a few steps toward the ridge where Jackson stood, stopping halfway as if unsure whether to return. The hesitation in the colt's posture mirrored Jackson's own conflicting emotions. Slowly, Jackson stood, his voice soft but steady. "You belong here, kid," he murmured. "Don't let me hold you back." But as he spoke the words, he realized how much he didn't want to let go. The question now was whether Sundance felt the same. The wind whispered through the trees as Jackson remained rooted on the ridge, his eyes locked on Sundance. The colt took a few tentative steps toward him, then paused, glancing back at the herd. It was as if Sundance was caught between two worlds, one offering freedom with his kind, and the other a bond with the man who had saved his life. Jackson clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "Go on, Sundance," he muttered under his breath. "This is where you belong." But Sundance didn't move. The colt hesitated, pawing at the ground nervously. The lead stallion let out a commanding snort from the clearing below, as if summoning him back. Sundance flicked his ears toward the sound but refused to budge. Jackson felt a tug in his chest as the colt's gaze softened. Sundance wasn't ready to leave him. A quiet, overwhelming warmth spread through Jackson, though he still wrestled with the guilt of keeping the colt from his natural life. Sundance took another step closer, his small frame framed by the sunlight breaking through the trees. Jackson finally crouched down, extending a hand toward him. "You've got a decision to make too, huh?" he whispered. The colt approached slowly, pressing his nose into Jackson's palm. Jackson gently rubbed the colt's muzzle, his voice soft. "I won't hold you back if you want to go. But if you stay, things won't be easy." Sundance nickered quietly, as if responding to the unspoken promise between them. Behind them, the herd grew restless. The lead stallion paced the edge of the clearing, his eyes narrowing as he observed the interaction. Wild herds valued order and loyalty, and Jackson knew the stallion might see Sundance's hesitation as a threat to that balance. The stallion stomped a hoof, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Jackson tensed, preparing for the possibility that the leader might charge in an attempt to assert his dominance. Instead, the stallion gave a low, frustrated snort and turned away, leading the herd back toward the stream. The message was clear: the offer to rejoin them wouldn't last forever. Sundance watched them go, his ears twitching indecisively. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant splash of water and the rustle of leaves. Jackson finally broke the silence. "Looks like they'll be moving on soon." "You sure about this?" Sundance stood tall, lifting his head as if making a final decision. The colt didn't follow the herd. Instead, he stepped closer to Jackson, his trust in the man undeniable. Jackson let out a slow breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He stood and gave Sundance a light pat on the neck. "All right, kid. Looks like it's you and me now." As they turned to head back toward the cabin, Jackson couldn't help but feel that their journey together was only just beginning. The days that followed brought a calm that Jackson hadn't experienced in years. The storm had long passed, and the valley began to heal. The river receded to its usual course, and patches of green grass returned to the fields. Jackson and Sundance settled into a steady routine. Every morning, Jackson would guide the colt around the cabin, helping him regain strength and coordination. Sundance was eager to learn, following Jackson's every move with an almost playful curiosity. One morning, Jackson took Sundance to a nearby field that stretched along the edge of the forest. "All right, let's see what you've got," he said, stepping back and waving his arm. Sundance hesitated for a moment, then broke into a light trot. As the colt moved, Jackson's mind flashed to memories of his youth, of riding Apache across those very fields. The sorrow that usually accompanied those thoughts was softer now, as if Sundance had begun to fill the void left by that loss. Sundance's trot turned into a full gallop, his legs moving with more confidence than ever before. Jackson watched in awe as the colt sped across the open space, his mane and tail flowing in the wind. There was something poetic in the sight, freedom and resilience embodied in one small but determined creature. Jackson crossed his arms and smiled. "You were born for this, weren't you?" he muttered. As the weeks passed, Sundance became more independent, exploring the surrounding area without straying too far from the cabin. Jackson noticed the colt's curiosity about everything: the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, even the creak of the cabin's porch steps. Sundance's spirit seemed brighter with each passing day, and Jackson found himself growing more attached. It was a connection unlike any he had known since losing his family and the ranch. Despite their progress, Jackson couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this peaceful life might not last. Sundance was still a wild Mustang at heart, and as much as Jackson tried to convince himself otherwise, he knew there might come a day when the colt would hear the call of the herd again. Jackson often caught himself looking toward the hills, wondering if the Mustangs were still nearby. Could Sundance resist the instinct to return to them when the time came? One evening, Jackson sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Sundance grazed quietly near the edge of the field, his silhouette glowing in the fading light. Jackson took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He felt an overwhelming mix of peace and uncertainty. "You've got your place here now," he whispered. "But I don't know how long that'll be enough." The question hung in the air as the darkness slowly swallowed the valley. A few days later, the stillness of the morning was shattered by a distant sound. Jackson had been chopping wood near the cabin when he heard it, an unmistakable whinny echoing across the valley. He froze, his axe resting on a log. Sundance, who had been grazing nearby, lifted his head abruptly. His ears flicked toward the sound, and his body tensed. Jackson set the axe down slowly, his heart sinking. Another whinny followed, closer this time. Jackson stepped out into the open field, shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon. Near the distant ridge, shapes began to emerge. Wild Mustangs, their powerful forms moving gracefully across the landscape. The lead stallion, the same one from before, was at the front, his head held high as he surveyed the valley. Jackson swallowed hard. The herd had returned. Sundance took a few steps forward, his nostrils flaring as he watched the herd approach. Jackson walked beside him and placed a hand gently on his neck. "They came back for you," he said quietly. The colt let out a soft whinny in response, clearly torn between the call of his kind and the bond he had formed with Jackson. Sundance shifted restlessly, his hooves pawing at the ground as if caught between two opposing forces. The herd halted at the edge of the field, their eyes watching Sundance intently. The lead stallion let out a low, commanding snort, urging the colt to come to them. Sundance glanced back at Jackson, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Jackson knelt beside him, speaking softly. "It's okay, Sundance. This is your chance. If you want to go, I won't stop you." His voice cracked slightly as he said the words. He had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. For what felt like an eternity, Sundance stood motionless. Then, slowly, he took a few steps toward the herd. Jackson's chest tightened, but he stayed where he was, refusing to hold the colt back. Sundance paused again, turning his head to look at Jackson one last time. The connection between them was undeniable, built on trust, survival, and a friendship neither of them had expected. Jackson gave a small nod. "Go on, kid. You'll be okay." With a final whinny, Sundance trotted toward the herd. The stallion and Mares accepted him without hesitation, forming a protective circle around him as they began to move away. Jackson stood in silence, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. The field felt emptier now, but Jackson didn't feel the crushing loneliness he had once feared. Sundance had come into his life when he needed it most, and now Jackson knew he had the strength to keep going. With a deep breath, he turned toward the cabin, a quiet sense of peace settling over him.